I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary. And I don't think either of those two could have been able to cope if they'd been anywhere else.
While the world was hypnotized by Diana's grace and Charles's royal stature, there was one figure in the shadows who saw past the dazzling facade. She didn't speak out. She didn't intervene. But she noticed everything. Princess Anne, stoic, sharp-eyed, and bound by duty, stood at the heart of the storm, watching as one of the most public love stories in royal history began to unravel from the inside out. And now, after decades of silence, her subtle reflections have cracked open a door long thought closed. Unlike her brother Charles or the emotionally expressive Diana, Anne had always been the embodiment of restraint. She didn't offer teary interviews. She didn't crave headlines. But her unwavering presence and iron sense of loyalty made her a cornerstone of the monarchy, one that absorbed more than it ever revealed. Beneath that composed exterior was a woman who knew the emotional cost of wearing the crown. And in the tragic saga of Charles and Diana, it was Anne's silence that now speaks volumes. When Diana entered the royal family, she became a global sensation almost overnight. The press crowned her the people's princess. Crowds swarmed wherever she went, and the institution, hungry for a symbol of modern fairy tale romance, elevated her image into legend. But behind palace walls, Anne saw something far more fragile, something cracking before the cameras ever captured it. She witnessed a young woman desperate for connection, lost in a world of ancient rules and suffocating expectations. And she saw her brother, emotionally stunted by a lifetime of royal conditioning, retreating deeper into himself. Ironically, the one royal who spoke the least about the drama may have understood it the most. Anne, raised under the same rigid structure as Charles, recognized the warning signs that others ignored. She had seen the pressure, the isolation, and the brutal collision between love and obligation play out before. But in Diana's case, there was an intensity Anne didn't quite relate to, a longing for emotional affirmation that the royal family simply wasn't built to provide. To Anne, duty was not a burden, it was survival. But for Diana, it became a prison. What makes Anne's perspective so haunting is that she never tried to stop the collapse. She never intervened or voiced concern. Instead, she watched dutifully, silently as the royal machine moved forward, indifferent to the personal devastation it was causing. And perhaps that's what makes her view so compelling. She didn't offer sympathy, but she offered truth. A truth shaped by her own sacrifices, her own heartbreaks, and her own cold understanding of what it means to be royal. Because in the monarchy, emotion is a luxury few can afford, and Anne knew that better than anyone. And so it began, not with love, but with duty. A choice that would haunt the monarchy for decades. From a teenager lost in the shadows of her older sister, to the chosen bride of Britain's future king, Diana's transformation stunned the world. It felt like a storybook fantasy, one destined for eternal glory. But from her perch within the palace, Princess Anne saw a different truth take shape. She watched, silent and knowing, as the fairy tale everyone celebrated began to unravel thread by delicate thread. Diana wasn't walking into love. She was walking into a performance, carefully cast and meticulously staged by a monarchy that prized image over intimacy. Diana first met Charles when she was just 16, a wide-eyed girl observing from the sidelines, while her sister, Lady Sarah Spencer, dated the prince. Nothing happened then, no spark, no whispers of romance. But Anne remembered her, not for beauty or charm, but for how invisible she seemed to the royal machinery at the time. Years later, that same invisible girl re-emerged, but this time, she wasn't just part of the background. She was the palace's answer to a growing problem. Charles was 32, still unmarried, and the pressure to find a suitable bride had reached a boiling point. The crown needed a match, not a soulmate. Anne understood the stakes. She too had once faced the cold reality of duty over desire. But watching her brother's courtship with Diana unfold, something felt rushed, manufactured. Diana ticked all the boxes. aristocratic roots, an unblemished reputation, and most crucially, a quiet demeanor the palace mistook for compliance. The speed of the engagement was alarming. It wasn't love that lit the fire under their union, it was expectation. And Anne, trained to spot fragility beneath surface grace, recognized that the foundation was already cracking. Then came the engagement interview. To the world, it was a charming exchange between two people stepping into history. But behind the smiles and carefully chosen words was a moment that chilled the air. "Are you in love?" a journalist asked. Diana, without hesitation, smiled and said, "Of course." Charles, with a half-laugh, added, "Whatever in love means." The comment would echo through the years, dissected by the press, historians, and ordinary people alike. But in that moment, Anne didn't need headlines to understand the damage it had done. She saw it on Diana's face, a flicker of unease, of something breaking beneath the surface. It wasn't just a poor joke. It was a glimpse into a truth no one wanted to admit. Charles and Diana were not speaking the same emotional language. In the days that followed, Diana was thrust into a world she wasn't prepared for. She moved into Clarence House and later into Buckingham Palace, a gilded cage disguised as a dream. Royal protocol tightened around her like a vice. She was taught how to wave, how to smile, how to disappear into tradition. Anne, who had long since mastered that cold ballet, watched Diana struggle. And she did not reach out. To Anne, discomfort was a rite of passage, not a cry for help. Diana's visible distress didn't evoke sympathy, it confirmed Anne's fears. This was not the woman for her brother. And this was not a marriage built to survive. As the royal family celebrated their newest addition, Anne stood apart, not unkind, but unconvinced. She had no patience for illusions, and what she saw wasn't love. It was obligation, ceremony. Another piece placed on the board by a palace obsessed with control. As Diana stepped into Buckingham Palace, she wasn't just joining a family, she was entering a battlefield masked in pearls and protocol. Diana cried for comfort, but the women she turned to offered only cold silence. And among them, one figure stood still, unyielding Princess Anne. Not cruel, not malicious, but firm in a way Diana couldn't comprehend. The divide wasn't born from conflict, it came from contrast. Diana, all heart, tears, and longing. Anne, all discipline, tradition, and steel. One looked for affection in a world built on order. The other had long accepted that order was all there was. From the beginning, their differences weren't just personal, they were irreconcilable. Diana entered the palace not just as a bride, but as a symbol young, delicate, and endlessly watched. Her emotions spilled freely, often painfully, in quiet hallways and guarded conversations. But Anne, who had learned early that royalty demanded suppression, not expression, saw such displays as a sign of weakness. Diana's tears were, to her, misplaced. Anne had grown up knowing that survival in the royal family meant mastering the art of endurance. No hand-holding, no coddling. The palace didn't bend to your spirit. You learned to fit the mold, or you were crushed by it. The longing that burned inside Diana, the need to feel loved, supported, embraced, was met with a kind of institutional coldness. She hoped Anne, the only daughter of the Queen, might extend some form of sisterly warmth. But Anne had no such role to offer. She wasn't raised to nurture. She was raised to perform. Diana mistook Anne's silence for disdain. But for Anne, emotion was private. It wasn't to be shared. It wasn't to be leaked into headlines or whispered in staff corridors, and certainly not spoken aloud in interviews that would one day become global spectacles. As Diana fumbled through royal protocol and bristled under scrutiny, Anne watched with a growing sense of resignation. To Anne, Diana's discomfort was inevitable, but not tragic. It was a phase every outsider endured, and Diana, in Anne's eyes, needed to toughen up. What Diana saw as emotional suffocation, Anne saw as standard operating procedure. The tiaras, the titles, the scrutiny, they were part of the deal. And sympathy? That wasn't a royal currency. The contrast between their weddings told its own story. Anne's 1973 ceremony had been stately, solemn, and without fuss. No balcony kiss, no media frenzy, no global obsession. Diana's wedding, on the other hand, was a made-for-television spectacle, a global event designed to dazzle. But behind the veil and under the silk, Diana was already unraveling. Anne saw it. She just didn't believe it was her place to fix it. To Anne, marriage wasn't about emotional gratification. It was about function, legacy, and image. Diana's desire for love and her public vulnerability only deepened the emotional gap between them. The divide became more than generational. It became personal. Diana felt abandoned. Anne felt misunderstood. And yet, neither woman truly hated the other. There were no screaming matches or overt rivalry. Just a growing chasm, fed by silence, shaped by two completely different ways of being. Diana wanted to be seen for who she was. Anne believed she should have been who the palace needed her to be. As Diana's fairy tale gown swept down the aisle, the cracks were already forming behind the scenes watched, but never mended. Diana was the spotlight. Anne was the shadow. One basked in public adoration, the other moved quietly through corridors of power. But don't be fooled by silence because the shadow knew everything. Princess Anne, restrained and largely unseen, had a front row seat to a royal unraveling. She didn't need headlines to understand the truth. She could feel it in the shifting glances, the uncomfortable silences, and the words never spoken. And when Prince William was born, the differences between Anne and Diana became impossible to ignore. The arrival of William in 1982 brought joy to the kingdom. But behind palace gates, it became another point of contrast between the sisters-in-law. Diana embraced motherhood with open arms, literally. She kissed her children in public, held them tightly, spoke openly about the joy they brought her. To a monarchy trained in emotional restraint, her behavior was revolutionary. It wasn't just love, it was defiance. Anne, on the other hand, believed in structure. She had raised Peter and Zara Phillips without royal titles, away from the spotlight. Her approach to parenting was built on discipline, discretion, and protection from the chaos of publicity. Public affection, in Anne's view, wasn't a sign of better motherhood, it was a breach of royal decorum. To Anne, Diana was too emotional, too public. She watched as Diana's popularity soared, fueled by her warmth and relatability. But Anne wasn't impressed by public tears or headline-grabbing interviews. She believed true strength was measured in quiet endurance, not in televised vulnerability. And yet, beneath her cool disapproval, Anne wasn't heartless. She had simply chosen a different path, one where feelings were buried beneath duty, and where sacrifice was a lifelong expectation, not a temporary burden. Still, the distance between the two women deepened. There were no confrontations, no scandals between them, just silence, awkward, heavy, and unmovable. Diana, already feeling isolated, found no ally in Anne, and Anne, fiercely loyal to the institution, saw no reason to offer one. As Diana's suspicions grew about Charles's lingering closeness to Camilla Parker Bowles, Anne remained silent. But she knew. Everyone did. And while Diana fought for clarity, for answers, for something resembling truth, Anne didn't need confirmation. She understood the rules. Charles's heart had never left Camilla, and that was never going to change. Anne's continued friendship with Camilla only complicated things further. Long before the scandal, before the whispers turned into front-page headlines, Anne had her own connection to Camilla's world. In the early 70s, Anne briefly dated Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's future husband. The royal social circle was tight, intertwined, and unbreakable. To Diana, this dynamic felt like betrayal. To Anne, it was simply history-old ties that never truly unraveled. So while Diana tried to navigate a world that kept changing its rules, Anne stayed steady in the shadow, unmoved and unreadable. The world cheered for royal babies, celebrated balcony kisses, and believed the dream was still alive. But Anne saw through it all. She didn't need to speak to understand the truth. She had lived through enough royal storms to know when one was coming. And while the world cheered for royal babies and balcony kisses, Anne could already see the storm brewing. Behind the palace doors, one woman cried alone, and the other watched, in silence. Diana, desperate for warmth, was slowly breaking. And Anne, ever composed, never moved a muscle. But in that silence lived a question that haunts the legacy of the monarchy to this day. Who was right? As Diana spiraled deeper into emotional torment, Charles quietly drifted toward the one place he had always found solace, Camilla. And while the public believed in the fantasy, within the palace walls, the truth was raw, uncomfortable, and irreversible. Charles didn't rage. He didn't shout. He simply withdrew. And in doing so, he left Diana to drown in loneliness. She had married into a life that promised fairy tales, but delivered only rules and rehearsed smiles. The man she had hoped would be her partner had disappeared emotionally, and now, physically, he was vanishing too. Camilla wasn't just a name Diana feared. She was a living reminder that Diana had never truly held Charles's heart. His connection to Camilla wasn't just rekindled, it had never been extinguished. And the deeper he fell into that familiar orbit, the more unhinged Diana became in private. Her cries for help took many forms. Some whispered, some screamed. Diana began battling bulimia, often in secret, punishing her body in search of control where she had none. Her self-worth eroded as the cold indifference of palace life grew louder in her mind. She once said it wasn't the paparazzi or the public pressure that broke her, it was the silence. The deafening silence inside her own home. She begged for attention, for care, for someone to see her as more than a crown-wearing symbol. But sympathy in the royal family was as rare as rebellion. And Anne, raised to believe that emotion was a private burden, offered nothing. The discovery of a bracelet confirmed what Diana had long suspected. It was meant for Camilla, engraved with the initials G and F, nicknames only Charles and Camilla shared. It wasn't just jewelry, it was proof. Tangible, cruel proof that she was never the woman he truly loved. Diana was shattered. But what did Anne feel in that moment? She never said. She never intervened. But those close to the family believed she saw the cracks, that she understood more than she would ever let on. The truth? Anne likely wrestled with her own conflict. Loyalty to her brother ran deep. Yet the human suffering before her eyes couldn't be entirely ignored. Still, she remained the observer, unflinching, detached. Her silence was not indifference, but duty, at least in her own mind. To Anne, the monarchy came first, always. But that didn't mean she was blind. She saw the erosion, she felt the tension, and deep down, perhaps she knew that something sacred had already been lost. Diana wasn't just falling apart. She was being erased in plain sight. And nobody moved to stop it. The crown demanded silence. But silence can speak louder than any scandal ever could. In a private room, away from the palace walls, and carefully, choreographed cameras, Diana confronted the one woman she believed had stolen everything. It was 1989. The party was meant to be light, celebratory, filled with smiles for Camilla's sister. But Diana wasn't there to play along. She was done pretending. She walked up to Camilla and told her quietly but firmly that she knew. That the affair wasn't a secret anymore. That she would no longer stand in the shadows of her own marriage. It wasn't rage that guided her. It was devastation. Years of humiliation, isolation, and betrayal had led to this moment. And though it was whispered behind closed doors, it shook the royal family to its core. Because in that confrontation, Diana did the one thing the palace feared most. She broke the illusion. Outside that room, Anne carried on with her engagements, her paperwork, her perfectly timed bows and handshakes. To the public, the royal family was united. But Anne knew better. She had seen it coming quietly, inevitably. She didn't need to hear the words Diana had said to Camilla. She already understood. The façade was cracked beyond repair, and yet Anne remained loyal to her code. To her, Emotions were not weapons. They were vulnerabilities to be managed and hidden. Diana's growing desperation, her decision to confront rather than conform, was a move Anne would never have made. Not because she didn't feel, but because feeling out loud was dangerous. Diana, on the other hand, had reached her breaking point long before that party. Losing Barry Manaki, her trusted bodyguard, and, as some claimed, her emotional anchor had left her fractured. His death in a mysterious motorcycle accident sent shockwaves through her already fragile sense of safety. To this day, Diana's own words suggest she believed his removal and untimely death were no coincidence. She trusted few people, and after him, perhaps no one. Anne, however, saw things differently. She didn't believe in conspiracies or emotional outbursts. She believed in control, even in grief, even in chaos. And she disapproved of Diana's vulnerability being aired so publicly, even privately. It wasn't royal. It wasn't safe. Yet behind Anne's controlled demeanor was quiet awareness. She saw what no one said aloud. Diana's confrontation with Camilla wasn't just about infidelity. It was about finally stepping out of the narrative the palace had written for her. And that terrified the institution. Still, the family did nothing. No intervention, no support, no acknowledgement. Diana's pain was treated like a passing storm, loud, inconvenient, but something they assumed would eventually fade. Anne didn't speak out, but she understood the weight of what had occurred. Because this wasn't just a marriage in trouble. It was a monarchy in denial. But what happens when silence turns into survival? And survival demands you break the royal code. The secrets were out. The illusion of a royal fairy tale lay shattered in front of millions. And for the first time, the silence that once protected the monarchy now worked against it. Andrew Morton's explosive book, secretly fed by Diana herself, tore the royal veil apart. Behind the glitz and protocol was a woman unraveling a woman battling bulimia, drowning in depression and contemplating the unthinkable. The world didn't just read her words, they felt her pain. And the monarchy, with its centuries-old armor, had never looked so vulnerable. Inside the palace, the fallout was nuclear. The press turned rabid. The people were stunned. But the family's response? Silence, once again. Except for Anne, who, though she never spoke publicly, couldn't keep the cracks from showing anymore. She had spent her life hiding emotion, defending structure, protecting the crown. But even she couldn't deny the damage that had been done. Privately, she disapproved of Diana airing her pain to the world. To Anne, duty came before exposure. Suffering in silence was a badge of honor, not a subject for books and television. Yet even Anne, as rigid as she was, began to understand this wasn't just scandal. This was survival. And Diana had chosen to fight back in the only way the palace had never prepared for, by telling the truth. Then came Charles's bombshell. In a 1994 televised interview, he admitted what many had already suspected. Yes, he had resumed his relationship with Camilla. Yes, the marriage with Diana had broken long before. He tried to frame it with dignity, insisting it had only happened after the love was lost. But the damage was done. The heir to the throne had just confessed to infidelity. And whatever shred of public sympathy he had retained was instantly thrown into the fire. Anne stood by him, not because she condoned the affair, but because loyalty to family, to image, was everything. She believed he had been unfairly judged, that the weight of his role justified his emotional retreat. But the public didn't agree. Diana was now more than a princess. She was a martyr in the court of public opinion. And then, the dagger. Diana's BBC interview with Martin Bashir. 22 million people watched as she stared into the camera and said the words that would echo through history. There were 3 of us in this marriage. It was the final blow. The monarchy couldn't recover from this one on charm or protocol. The Queen, always careful to stay above the storm, finally stepped in. She wrote letters to both Charles and Diana. The message was clear. The marriage had to end. Quietly, but firmly, she ordered a divorce. Anne had been through it before. Her own divorce from Mark Phillips had come and gone with barely a ripple. No televised drama, no tell-all books, just a quiet separation followed by a private remarriage. But this was chaos, and even she, the palace's most dutiful daughter, couldn't mask the reality. The institution she had defended all her life was being torn apart from the inside. The fairy tale was over. But the aftermath? That would shake the monarchy to its core. One was gone, one was forgiven, and one, the silent sister, remained to witness what the world would never forget. When the divorce was finalized in August 1996, there was no celebration, no relief, just a collective exhale across the monarchy. The curtain had finally dropped on the performance that had unraveled in real time, watched by millions. Charles and Diana were no longer husband and wife, but the war hadn't ended. It had merely changed shape. Public opinion shifted swiftly. Diana, bruised but unbroken, emerged not as a fallen royal but as something far more powerful, a global icon with a cause. While Charles worked to repair his image behind palace gates, Diana stepped out into the world, unfiltered and untamed. Her humanitarian work wasn't just symbolic, it was seismic. She held the hands of AIDS patients when others wouldn't even enter the room. She walked through minefields, not just to raise awareness, but to stand where fear once ruled. The public adored her. The world believed in her, and the monarchy, still wounded from the truth she had exposed, struggled to reclaim its voice. In this storm of legacy and reinvention, Anne remained unchanged. She had never played to the crowd, never wavered from the quiet, grueling rhythm of duty. While the media chased Diana, Anne opened hospitals. While headlines swirled around Charles and Camilla, Anne kept her calendar full and her mouth shut. But then, everything stopped. On the final day of August 1997, tragedy struck with a force that shattered not just a family, but a nation. Diana was dead. A car crash in Paris. The news echoed like thunder. The people's princess was gone, and the grief was immediate and explosive. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace in silence and in tears. And for once, even the monarchy seemed unsure of its next move. Anne, at Balmoral with the rest of the family, stood firm. She supported the Queen's decision to shield William and Harry from the media in those crucial hours. But the backlash was swift. The public wanted a response emotion, acknowledgement, something. Anne, true to herself, didn't speak. But when she walked behind Diana's coffin in the funeral procession, her silence said more than any statement ever could. In the years that followed, Anne would speak rarely, almost never, about that time. But when she did, her words carried a quiet wisdom. She admitted the palace had gone through darkness. That loneliness was part of the job. That pain often lived just beneath the surface of royal life. No dramatics, no confessions, just truth, measured and hard-earned. Diana had spoken her truth to the world. Charles had, in time, reclaimed his own. But Anne had revealed hers without ever opening her mouth. Because sometimes, survival doesn't require explanation. It requires endurance. And in the aftermath of scandal, love, betrayal, and death, Princess Anne stood exactly where she always had. Not in the spotlight, not in the tabloids, but in the shadow, steady, unsentimental, and unshaken. And maybe that's Anne's greatest revelation, not what she said, but what she chose to never say aloud. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.